Good evening, everyone, and we're back for a wonderful evening of Corona conversations in the Black and Brown community. Today's show we're dedicating to Black History Month, and I think it's going to definitely be a great discussion, and we're going to have some great food for thought. So as usual, we'll start off with a basic introduction about our guest, as well as about today's topic. So this statue represents one of the many statues that have been removed from here in New York City after what has gone on with our Black Lives Matter protests. So this was actually the statue of Dr. Marion Sims, which was located in Bryant Park here in New York City. And the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, decided that it needed to be removed. For those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Sims, he is actually considered the father of obstetrics and gynecology. He came up with the speculum, as well as treatments for vesical vaginal fistulas. The problem was that this was done at the expense of Black women. He experimented on slaves without their approval and also without the use of anesthesia. So although he came up with wonderful things that we can use in medication and medicine, he unfortunately did it at the expense of Black bodies. As usual, tonight you have myself, Dr. Allison Myers, and my co-moderator, Dr. Williams, who will be guiding us through tonight's conversation. And as we all know, COVID continues to be a problem in this country. The pandemic has continued to affect millions and millions of Americans. As of today, the CDC is reporting that we have a total number of almost 27 million cases, with 121,212 new cases. The average daily cases per 100,000 in the last 7 days is 40.5. Total deaths have been as high, unfortunately, as almost 450,000, with 3,756 new deaths in the past day. But hopefully there is a glimmer of hope with the onset of vaccine distribution. We were supposed to be at 100 million vaccines within a month, but unfortunately we're only about 1/3 there. As of today, the CDC is reporting that 35.2 million vaccines have been distributed in our country. When we look at the stats, we can see that although the number of cases is greater in white non-Hispanics, when you look at the proportion of whites compared to that of Blacks and Hispanics, our numbers are actually worse off. In addition, the data that only about 72% of people have identified their race or ethnicity. So there's still another 20-something% who we're not sure about. When we look at deaths, it's the same thing. If you look here, we see that non-Hispanic whites have died the most. But again, when you look at the proportion of the percentage of people in the country, the rate of death is far greater in Black non-Hispanics, American Indians, and Hispanic Latinos. And for this data, roughly 50% of people acknowledge their race and ethnicity. So there's still a lot of people that were not identified. If we also think about these new variants that have popped up, we can see the new variants are B.1.1.7, also known as the UK variant. We have 541 cases reported in the US, and this is based on reporting from 33 states. So of course, we live in a place where we have 50 states, so this is not reporting for everyone. Also, many institutions are not routinely checking for this, and it's predicted that this UK variant is actually probably going to be the most common variant here in the United States shortly. Then we have the B.1.3.5.1 variant, also known as the South African variant, in which we've had 3 cases reported, but this is only from 2 states. And last but not least, we have the P1, also known as the Brazilian variant, in which we've had 2 reported cases, and the number of states reporting is only 1. And unsurprisingly, the states that have the largest number of these variants, when the testing is being done, are going to be the places where we have more higher populations, such as California, Florida, and New York. And we think about the vaccine that is being used for COVID, there's a lot of apprehension and trepidation because in this country, our bodies have been experimented upon. And I think the most common thing that people refer to was the Tuskegee experiment, which actually took place here in America, in the South, in Alabama. at a time where people could be enrolled in a study without having to provide informed consent. Informed consent is a form that you're supposed to fill out prior to conducting a study to know what are the risks and benefits of your participation in the study. There were roughly 600 men who were enrolled, and 399 of them had syphilis. The remaining didn't. And during the time of the quote unquote experiment, the treatment for syphilis, which is penicillin, was discovered. But these patients were not given this. And we're going to hear more about this tonight. And just to make it more real, because first, a lot of people, they think, oh, well, Tuskegee ended in the 70s. It really didn't matter. It doesn't affect me. Well, it does, because it wasn't until 1997 in which President Clinton actually issued an apology to the survivors. And of course, by then, most of them had deceased. So for the most part, it was their children or grandchildren here for this. And then in 2004, which is only 15 years ago, the CDC decided to fund $10 million in a cooperative agreement at Tuskegee University for their National Center of Bioethics and Research in Healthcare. Another travesty was that of Henrietta Lacks. She was an African-American woman whose cancer cells were used for cancer research without her approval. And these cells were known as the HeLa cells. And they really had things that weren't familiar. But again, going back to that informed consent, Henrietta Lacks never gave consent for her cells to be used. And these are her grandchildren here, and they were issued a settlement many years after she died. And in more recent times, here in the good old UK, they're actually recommending that patients take only 10 micrograms a day of vitamin D, but studies have shown in Europe that for people of color, you need a higher dose. So melanin is very protective, obviously, against the sun. And that's why Black patients or people who have brown skin, whether they're Asian or Hispanic, tend to require vitamin D supplementation. And keeping this in mind, it's unfortunate that the United Kingdom was so insensitive to recommend that all people needed to only take 10 micrograms of vitamin D daily, when a study that was done in Sweden of Black residents showed that you need more like 18 micrograms. So don't think that these medical injustices are something of your grandparents or your parents' generation. It's still happening today. And we do know that there is an association with low vitamin D levels and COVID. And I think this one is probably one of the worst that I've seen. And this was at my alma mater, the University of Virginia, in which lay people, which is study number one, as well as medical students in their first, second, third year, questions about Blacks in comparisons to whites. Now, as we know, several of these things are not accurate. For example, that Blacks age more slowly than whites, or Blacks' nerve endings are less sensitive than whites. We all have the same type of nerve endings. But what makes this so hard to deal with is the fact that Black patients, when we say we need pain medication or we're in pain, we're usually undertreated. And they found in a study that the providers who thought that our nerve endings were less sensitive than whites were more likely during simulation to provide pain medicine to a Black patient when compared to a white patient. And again, this study was published just in 2016. So this is still happening in modern medicine. As usual, we would like to thank all of you for tuning in every week. We would like to thank our co-sponsor, Women of Integrity, Sister Shantae Carter. Thank you to your organization for co-sponsoring tonight. We also like to thank Dr. Naomi Maria, Ms. Tiffany Harvin, the Department of Medicine, the Chayor, our day one audience members. And please follow us on Twitter at Minority Health 3 or on Instagram at minorityhealth.combos. So today, I'm so happy to present someone who is like a legend in my neighborhood, Mr. Andrew Jackson, also Professor Andrew P. Jackson, also known as Mr. Sekou Molofi Bayako. He is the former executive director of the Queens Library's Langston Hughes Community Library and Cultural Center, where I had the pleasure of meeting him about 20 years ago. He also was appointed to the Queens Library Board of Trustees. He's an adjunct professor in Black Studies and Cultural Diversity at York College, as well as a professor of library science at the Queens College Graduate School of Library and Information Studies. And I am so happy that we were able to get him on today's show because I think there's a lot of great discussion that will be generated, and we look forward to your questions. I will now turn it over to my co-moderator, Dr. Maya Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. I'm not too sure if Professor Jackson wants to give his presentation now, or if he will wait a little later on to give the presentation.
I'll let you decide when you would like me to speak. I'm good.
Sure, you could go ahead because the presentation Dr. Meyer gave was fire. So please continue the fire.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this program. It's good to see everybody. This is one of the things we talked about a little earlier, and I realized since doing the Kwanzaa presentations over the holiday season, that the one plus factor in doing virtual lectures is that the audience you reach is broader and more expansive than it would be if you're waiting for people to come to your location to sit and listen to your lecture or your panel discussion. And the example is my triplet sister Mabel is logged in today from Rancho Cucamonga in California, and my older sister Helen is logging in from Stonington, Connecticut. So it just gives you a sense of East Coast, West Coast following these presentations, and look forward to the questions and answers following the discussion. When I first started doing some research on what I initially called medical racism in America, somebody said, you need to balance that off because you're talking about all the negative things like the Tuskegee experiment and the experiment on by Dr. Sims. I thought I'd started off with some positives about that African American people have had in medicine and in medical research. So I'm citing Patricia Bath, who was a pioneer in treatment and prevention of blindness. And when you ever go to the doctor and get your eyes checked and they start giving you the laparoscope to deal with testing you for cataracts, you have to thank Dr. Patricia Bath for that. Alexa Kennedy, who was the first African-American neurosurgeon in the United States in 1981. Emmett Chappell, who was a NASA biochemist and inventor with over 14 US patents, supported the NASA manned space flights with research of accurate detection of bacteria in water that's used when they explore the different planets and galaxies. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, who was the first African-American physician in the United States and first and only African-American graduate from the New England Female Medical College in 1864. Of course, we've heard of Dr. Mae Jamison, who was a medical doctor that many people may have forgotten that. First African-American woman admitted to the United States astronaut training program and the first African-American woman in space in 1992. And one of the first doctors that I became enamored with was Dr. Jocelyn Elders, who was the first African-American Surgeon General in 1993 under the Clinton administration. And historically, Dr. Daniel Hill Williams, one of the first physicians in the United States to perform open heart surgery in 1893, and founded the first racially integrated nursing and intern program in the United States at Providence Hospital and Training School for Nurses in 1891. If you go back further, you have to give credit to the man who's considered the father of modern medicine in the third dynasty of Egypt, Imhotep. Greek civilizations ignored his accomplishments and give credit to Hippocrates as the father of modern medicine, but his contributions took place 2,000 years after Imhotep. So we have to remember that we've been part of the medical community and making contributions to medical and medical research for thousands of years, but very few people are aware of that because it's never covered in terms of, or even recognized in medical and research fields. When you look at the concept of medical racism, and I broaden the concept of medical racism, not just within medicine, but I look at it on a number of different levels, and I'll show you why I do that. The following up with the contributions that were just made by Sister Ali, you have to talk about Dr. James Marion, who is considered the father of modern gynecology, but he performed shocking experiments on enslaved women. And his decision not to use any numbing techniques or anesthesia make you understand and appreciate the pain and that our Black women endured as slaves, as property, when they were being explored and exploited on sexual test cases on plantations in Alabama. And then came to New York City and opened up a medical clinic and worked here in the United States, in New York City as well. His medical ethics have been challenged and based on the enormous suffering his patients experienced. And Black slave women were a vulnerable population in the 19th century South, and as well as the patients that he had here in New York City. And I'm glad to see that the statue they had enamoring him for so many years has been taken down. Thank you to the current mayor. One of the first cases that I ever heard about was the Tuskegee study that was done in Alabama in 1932. One of the most outrageous abuses of African-American men who were infected with syphilis, never told that they were being infected with syphilis, where the trust that they had that they were going to be used for other medical experimentation that was harmless, turned out to not only impact them for many years, but also their family members and anybody their family members interacted with, because they were contracting syphilis, they were spreading syphilis, they were never treated for syphilis, and even the children that they bred were born with syphilis. So if you've ever know anything about syphilis, you know how dangerous and how deafening it can be to the lives of people around you and to the people that you interact with on a regular basis. The study was discontinued in 1972. So from 1932 to 1972, this experiment was going on and people were being infected with this, and the families were never told. It only became public knowledge when an article was written by the Associated Press that talked about this experiment, and America was shocked that this was going on. And as was indicated, President Clinton made a public apology in 1997 to the 8 remaining survivors, declaring that the attitudes that had been led to such study was clearly racist. So it's clear that only very few presidents have been that vocal about something that was this detrimental to our people, our men, and the future of our young people. I look at, so those are 3 cases. But I also found, if you are at all familiar with a book called Medical Apartheid by Henrietta Washington that came out a few years ago, that there are other cases that you might remember as I mentioned them, that this is an excellent work on the extent of as she calls it, the dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to the present. And I'm only going to cite 3 of the cases she mentions here. Southern discomfort, medical exploitation on the plantations. She writes, and I quote, "Enslavement could not have existed and certainly could not have persisted without medical science. However, physicians were also dependent upon slavery, both the economic security and for the enslaved clinical material that fed the American medical research and medical training that boasted physicians' professional advancement." So the slaves were there at the whim and mercy of the plantation owners. Psychologically, you look at the fact that slavery itself was medical apartheid, that the whole experience of being free on the African continent, being kidnapped and enslaved, put into the bowels of a slave ship in shackles and chains to psychologically break you and continually tell you that you are no longer a free human being, you are now enslaved property, is medical apartheid. And then the endurance of what they experienced, women and men on the slave ships. Women were raped repeatedly on the slave ships for the pleasure of the crew. And many women themselves jumped overboard just to gain their freedom, to keep from being kept as slave property and enslaved and brought to the United States. So that whole slave experience is one. There's a second one that I was reminded of when I looked through this book earlier today, in her chapter called Circus Africanus. And this may bring back memories from when this was a very heavy conversation in the 1980s about a South African woman called Sankey Bartman, who was renamed the Hottentot Venus. And because of the build that she had and the protruding buttocks, she was put on display by a surgeon, British surgeon, Dr. William Dunlap, who brought her to Europe. And since Barton did not know she was about to enter an arena where she would become an object of unbridled medical curiosity and physical lust. So she was abused, renamed the Hottentot Venus, and often portrayed stripped and replaced with as a satanic creature, and put on display as a circus act and in a museum until she was eventually freed and she passed away. And you can do research on that as well. In the chapter they have called The Restless Dead, Anatomical Dissection and Display, talks about a 60-year-old retired auto mechanic who disappeared and eventually is found and at the Howard University Hospital, and his body is about to be dissected for experimentation. So quite often we see on the milk cartons and things, people who just disappear. And quite often we think of that they've been kidnapped and they've been sent overseas somewhere and they're now serving as slaves or put in work conditions that are deplorable. There may be a percentage of those people who disappear and wind up being used for medical experimentation, and their families never hear from them again. So this book is one that is very much worthy of reading, or if your stomach can take some of the information you're going to see in here, but it reminds you of the question, why are so many African American people distrustful of this new vaccine for COVID? And one of the reasons is that as long as we've been connected with America, we have been medical apartheid treated. We have been enslaved. We have been psychologically abused. We have been mentally abused. We've been legally abused. And our distrust of the medical community, in line with what you just heard about the Tuskegee experiment going back to 1932, lends itself to a mistrust. Women mistrust going to a gynecologist because they're not sure how they're going to be treated or what kind of treatment or what level they're going to be treated. This is not unusual in this country. And the latest concern that I just heard about on the news today, women who are pregnant or looking to get pregnant are concerned about taking the vaccine because of the unknown. They have no idea what the impact of this vaccine will have on your getting pregnant or what it will have on your existing pregnancy and what the impact will be to the fetus, but also to the women. So even as late as today, this morning, this raises questions about the vaccine and people wanting to take the vaccine willingly when we have so much information that we do not know about the impact that this vaccine will have today, whether it will be impacting the new strains that were just talked about in this country, or what will happen to us as human beings. And in essence, as somebody was saying that I talked to about this recently, we're all experiments in this vaccine because the virus has only been around going on a year in this country. There's not enough research. There's not enough experimentation. There's not enough study being done to justify that, yes, it will stop the virus. Yes, it will be good for us. And we're not sure where we're going with this. It's just too much information and the unknown. But I also looked at physical, mental, psychological, social, and legal ramifications of what I call medical apartheid in this country, going back to even the design of United States of America. Declaration of Independence of the colonies from British rule. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This country was designed for rich white men. women had no rights. Women weren't even considered that when they talked about all men are created equal. And when they wrote that document declaring freedom from British rule, we were being enslaved and kidnapped going back to 1450 and brought here as free slave labor to build and develop this country. Medical apartheid, psychological, mental, and mental and physical abuse. The Constitution of the United States legalizes the international slave trade from 18 through 1808, 20 years from the time it was written in 1776. So the question that I asked when I first saw that, if the Constitution legalizes slavery through 1808, why didn't slavery legally end until 1865 at the end of the Civil War? So what's written on paper does not necessarily mean that it was in the best interest of the African-American women or men or children. And the fact that slavery continued after the Civil War through Reconstruction, which ends in 1877, there's a whole new domestic slave trade that existed, so slavery continued. So the Constitution says 1808. Slavery didn't end legally until after Reconstruction, which is 1877. So even the legal document of the Constitution legalizes an international slave trade, the kidnap and exploitation of African people as a legal process for this country. So if it did that to America, benefited America economically, what did it do to the African continent and the destruction of African civilizations and communities on the African continent? Article 1 legalizes the slave trade. Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 9 designates the African as private property and 3/5 of a human being for taxation and legal political representation. So we're not even considered humans, we're private property. And the Constitution supports the protection of private property by slave owners. Who wrote the Constitution? Slave owners. Who signed the Constitution? Slave owners. Who are the first 12 presidents of the United States? Slave owners. So the concept of this country is based on medical apartheid. Article 4, Section 2 allows for the legal return of that private property and the protection of the slave master for whatever abuse he perpetuates on the male and female slaves who run away. So the legacy and impact of the slave trade decades after slavery legal ended. Transatlantic slave trade from 1450 to 1865. First level. Second level, of course, 1877 with the domestic slave trade. Domestic slave trade, 1865 to 77. New slavery, sharecropping, convict leasing is a whole nother legal ramification of Black men being freed at the end of the Civil War, looking for jobs, are now exploited because they are arrested for not having a job. And if you could not show a physical means of support, then you were violating the law. You could be arrested for loitering. You go to jail, complete your, say, 30-day sentence for loitering, but you now have received a $50 fine. Slaves have no money. They weren't paid for the labor. So now you can't pay the fine. Convict leasing was a way for the cities, the towns, the counties to use that slave labor as free slave labor for the township, for the county, for the cities, and get paid for it on the backs of slaves. That's what they called, in Michelle Alexander's new form of slavery. Ethnology. In the 19th century, between the 1830s and 1840s, British scientists came up with this concept of ethnicity, polygenesis. Blacks and whites had to come from two separate species. Therefore, they cannot be equal. Whites are superior to blacks, and blacks are inferior to whites. Inherently, blacks are inferior to white justifies the permanent existence of slavery in America. Craniology. The size of the brain of Black folks and white folks is different. So white folks' brain is larger, therefore they must be more intelligent. Black folks' brains are smaller, so they have to be less intelligent, and they have to be less be able to accept and do and live with freedom. They justifies the permanent existence of slavery in America. And this is done through scientists. We turn about Henrietta Lacks. Her family did not find out about these HeLa cells and that her cells were being used for medical research until they were at a luncheon some 60 years later, and they were having at a luncheon, and they would find out that this happened to their relative, and they were never informed of it. There was never anything approval given by Miss Lacks, and her family never benefited, and there were $1 billion made. Her cells today are part of the original research used to create the viruses that are here for the pandemic. So even today, the HeLa cells are the fundamental basis for research that's done when it comes to creating vaccines, and many of the vaccines that we know of came out of the research that was done from the HeLa cells. It says that everywhere in the world, the scientific community is racing against time to save humanity from the ongoing pandemic. Scientists and frontline workers are being hailed for their selfless service, but one individual who awaits her due is Henrietta Lacks. Her cells, say American virologist Angela Rasmussen, were used to study the effect of SARS-CoV on humans, providing inputs for the development of vaccine. And this was through the World News when it talks about the vaccine. Another example of how historically we've been mistreated as we went to receive medical care. Bessie Smith, the blues singer in the South and recording artist, was injured in a car accident while traveling from Mississippi to Memphis, Tennessee. She was gravely injured in an automobile accident. Her arm was nearly severed. And rumor has it that the doctor on the scene ignored her while he tended to the bumps and scrapes of a white couple in a nearby fender bender. She was not, one of the reasons she died from this accident was because the hospitals in that area would not accept her because she was a Black woman. And she had to drive hours. They drove her for hours to find a hospital that would accept her, which meant they had to find a Black hospital because most white hospitals would not treat Black women or Black men if they were brought to the hospital. Another example is the mistreatment of Black soldiers in World War II. Not only were there were issues that doctors would not work on Black soldiers, but Black soldiers were mistreated and abused as American soldiers. German prisoners of war were treated better in this country, traveling to the South to concentration camps, than Black soldiers were treated, and they were coming from war with medals on their chests that they had received from Europe. The law's inherent inferiority and white supremacy, the Dred Scott decision in 1857. The Missouri Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, who was a slave that was petitioning the courts for his freedom, first, he could not petition the courts because he was a slave and was not a citizen of the United States. Second, even the decision, Supreme Court decision indicated that even free Blacks could never be citizens of the United States, and that the founding fathers never intended for Blacks, free or slave, to be citizens of the United States. Legal mental slavery, because what is it telling you as a human being, a Black person in America? I'm less than, I'm inferior. The Constitution was not written for me and mine. So you go back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How can you have that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness when you are slaves for 450 years, or the laws were not written with you in mind to begin with, and it's documented by a Supreme Court case? Louisiana Act 111 in 1890 was written for the comfort of passengers, legalizes the color line, and mandated racial segregation on public railroads. That's the beginning of the Jim Crow laws that we talked about as part of the civil rights movement of the 1950s. Anything laws that were passed that talked about comfort, public good, or public comfort was written for the public good, public comfort of white passengers, not Black passengers. Mississippi Plan of 1890 disfranchised Blacks designated the poll tax. You have to be able to read and reasonably interpret state constitution in Louisiana. So that means that reading was illegal. For those who could read, you had to be able to read to interpret the state constitution. Legal documents are argued in court by lawyers who go to school to get a law degree to argue and the interpretation of the law. So even if a Black person could read well enough to come up with an interpretation of the Constitution, the majority of the time in those polling places and the polling centers in the South, the person who's on the other side of the table that was white was probably as illiterate as you were, but that the decision of whether you could or could not interpret the Constitution to a reasonable level was left to a white clerk. So discriminating to the very extent, the extremity of the laws was part of that psychological, legal, medical apartheid in the South. Of course, the other case that comes up in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. A Black man who has Black and white blood is petitioning in the courts to be treated equally on the train. It sanctions, again, the outcome of that Supreme Court case, sanctions legal segregation, separate but equal. Long as you got a place on a train and I got a place on the train, it's equal. No matter that I'm in a luxury car and you're in a smoke car behind the engine with all the smoke or all the lumber for that in the train that's coming into your car. White only signs, colored only signs develop a sense of inferiority throughout the South, and that becomes constant through the civil rights movement. So those are the cases that I cite. And again, when I look at historically, when I look at medical apartheid, I'm looking at it both medically, physically, psychologically, sociologically. You can look at communities that are creating housing complexes with thousands of families living on top of each other in rat-infested, vermin-infested projects with lead paint on the wall, and they call that living, where you got people living in luxury condominiums out on Long Island with in societies and living arrangements where they are Black free, where there's a name for them, limited access housing, where you have some of the most racist, not racist, but segregated areas in New York State are found out in Long Island. So we live in these conditions. And the irony that we're living in this time now where Black Lives Matter has brought all of this to the forefront. Things are being discussed today that were not even discussed after the civil rights period and after the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, that we are in the 21st century, closing in on the first quarter of the 21st century, and we still live in a society where we can't validate that we are truly free and have life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness in America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jackson. That was very informative. That was a lot. And you gave us a history of medical apartheid. I just want to ask a question. Anti-Blackness is the dehumanization of our Black bodies and the systematic marginalization of Black people. And although you gave us the history, I'm just curious to know, what are the ways that you have seen anti-Blackness play out in society today? And what do you think that we can do to move to an anti-racist or equity society?
I think we see it every day, and even ways that we don't even realize until it's brought to our attention. I was talking to Sister Myers about what she probably went through to get her doctorate degree, and in the circles that we live in, no matter what field you're in, if you're successful in that field, there are people in white America that say you only got that far because of affirmative action. Not that you were intelligent enough to earn a PhD or go through the PhD process, not that you worked hard enough to get it, but that just because of affirmative action, you got in the door and you succeeded because of affirmative action. I think that's another form of racial racism in this country that is constantly in our faces. I think the fact that young people experience racism and don't even know it because they don't understand what racism is in this country. Um, Martin Luther King talked about it being 8 years old and having a buddy that was his little buddy, the white buddy that lived across the street, and they were play pals until he was in the middle school and his father said, "Now you can't play with Martin anymore because he's a nigger." All of a sudden, there's something wrong with Martin. When I'm talking about diversity to my graduate students in library science, I teach a course in libraries in a multicultural society. I said, America is a contradiction. You go to any daycare center. Well, let's back up. The world is based on diversity. If you go to a botanical garden, there's not one kind of flower. There's not one kind of tree or one kind of bush. All these beautiful flowers, all these fragrances, all these colors, all these style, all these different living things. That's diversity. You go to a daycare center and you see all these children playing together. They don't care what you look like. They don't care what your skin color is. They don't care about the size of your lips or your nose or the texture of your hair. You're a little kid, you want to play? I'm good with you. Let's play. There's a commercial I saw a little while ago of these two little kids, black and white kids, seeing each other, and they run up and hug each other. Love is natural. Hate is taught. Racism is not natural. Racism is taught. So this is part of the concept, the fabric of what America was developed on. America was developed on racism. So the tragedy of it is, in the 21st century, W.B. Du Bois talked about the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So another 100 years, we're now in 2021, it's still the problem of the color line. We've made so much progress in so many levels. We can take somebody to the moon. Technology, computers, scientific advancements. We've done so much in so many areas, but in terms of the human factor, we still have not made enough progress where color doesn't matter. And if you look at it, what difference does color make to coming up with a vaccine for COVID? What difference does color make in terms of somebody becoming a judge on the Supreme Court? What difference does color make if you're going to be an architect and you're going to design the Empire State Building or the World Trade Center? Color should have nothing to do with it. But we have not made enough progress, serious humanitarian project in this country to move forward where color doesn't matter. And one of the quotes that I use with my students, we need to celebrate difference until difference doesn't make a difference anymore. But it does. That's tragic. That's tragic. And unfortunately, over the last 4 years, 45, the president who was the 45th president of the United States fed on that violence and that hatred and that racism to create the environment that we saw on January 6th throughout his administration. And all those people that hated the fact that there was a Black president for 2 terms festered for that 8 years. And this 4 years, they've been enabled by this man to be openly racist, to be openly active on that racism and that hate. And what you see on January 6th, and what you see, the violence, the difference in how 1,200 Black people that went to Washington last summer, and they shut down Washington, D.C., boarded up all the businesses. 10,000 white people come to Washington, D.C., and they're so unprepared, shock for what they did to the Capitol. I could have told you that was going to happen. He told them that morning, let's go to the Capitol. I'm coming with you. And he lied then. That's the way this country reacts. You saw the racism and the hatred that happened on television with Black men being killed by the police. You would think that the cameras and police having to show what happened in an incident like that this would stop. If you go online and you put in Blacks killed by the police, you're going to see hundreds of cases of Black people killed by the police. Not just those 7 or 8, not just the Breonna Taylors and the Floyds, and that's maybe 10 or 12 or 50. You're going to see hundreds, and many of them you've never even heard about. So this is a festering sore that America has. As Martin Luther King talked about, the other America. There's a white America and there's the other America. And the other thing to keep in mind, that when you talk about this happening to Black folks, this happens to people of color. Asians were mistreated when they came here. Mexicans were mistreated, and most of this was their country before white people came and took it over. The Native American has been mistreated.
I was about to comment on Native
Right
American.
on. Treaties broken. This is an American phenomenon. This is the American way of life. So we should not be shocked that it still happens. We need to be shocked that it's not stopping. And this maybe, just maybe, with the discussions we see with Black Lives Matter, maybe we're going to see something come out of it and it is stopped.
Thank you. I'm happy that you mentioned Native Americans, because very, very, very often they are left out of the conversation. And I have a couple of Native American friends who always tell me that that was the land before anybody else's land. Right. Before I ask you the other question, I just wanted to point out two things. One, there was a recent report, I believe it was the New York Times, that came out Saturday in terms of vaccine distribution, that was mainly saying that white individuals were leaving the wealthy communities and going to the communities. I think it was Washington Heights in New York, yeah, and actually taking away, like, you know, the vaccines. And just today I saw somebody saw on Twitter that we need to do a better, you know, we need to have a better rollout for the vaccine, in terms of, it's very simple as asking individuals, where is your zip code? And if that's not your zip code, then I'm sorry, but you cannot get the vaccine. The other thing is, and I'd be remiss as an IO psychologist if I don't mention that, but very often we speak about the patients and racism in the patients, but we often forget the racism that the Black doctors themselves face while they work. So recently we heard of Dr. Susan Moore, who she was a Black female physician, and she did a video on Facebook where she spoke about her, you know, again, pain. She was feeling pain, she was in pain, and she didn't think that she was getting the proper care. Lucky for, well, I cannot say lucky for her, but she documented this, and she was sent home, and then a week later or so, she died. And the response from the hospital was very much, she was sort of almost saying like she was too educated and she knew too much, and so she threatened the staff. There was also Dr. Ben Danielson, who first, I think he made a report in 2009 about some racial incidents as his organization, and he had to resign. I believe it was either late last year, or early this year, because he just no longer could take the racism that was going on. We have to talk about the Flexner report of 1910, where they were just like, Black physicians are not as educated, or they are unable to or incapable of treating Black patients. And so a number of medical schools were closed down. And today, the Black medical schools graduate more physicians or more Black physicians than the 10 top predominantly white schools or white medical schools in the United States. So that just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. So let's talk a little bit more about, how do you believe, because I think that there are some individuals who sort of, when we talk about the mistrust of the system, and that's why, or the mistrust of the health system, and that's why Black people or brown people are not getting vaccinated, there are a lot of, that's not really the case. So what would you say in a case like that, or how would you say that, you know, the history of medical mistrust in our communities are now affecting vaccine uptake within our communities?
I think that I'm not surprised. The fact that people coming from Long Island or Westchester County coming down into the city, into Black neighborhoods to get their vaccines. There was a incident of that shown on the news this morning. That happens regularly. So that doesn't surprise me. The question is how this whole system was rolled out, and the planning that should have gone into this is still fractional. It's the federal government is saying it's up to the states. The states are blaming the federal government, but the people are the ones that are suffering. So there are small cases there. My sister was telling me about it, and it was covered on the news last week, about this doctor in Southern California, who personally has gone out and made sure that over 3,500 people were vaccinated in one day in South Central LA to make sure they get the COVID vaccine. It can work, but it's got to be done on the local level. The amount of vaccines have to be available in the community. This whole situation, my sister was saying she was on the phone most of the day trying to get an appointment, and until almost an hour before 5 o'clock, she was told, after she went through the whole process, went further than any other time she's called in. She did sealed all the information out, did all the documentation and validation, and then find out there are no appointments available. So there's still some issues that have to be developed on the local level, not just the state, but the local levels, to make sure that the people in those communities using zip codes or whatever criteria they want to use are, when they want to get vaccine, those people can get vaccinated. That has to be worked out, but it's still so fractionalized that people are suffering in the meantime, or they've been trying to get through on the phone line for weeks and can't get through. That's got to be solved. That's got to be solved, and it's got to be solved quickly if this is going to make a difference. The other answer to your question earlier was, one of my remedies to all of this, which will take time, is corrections in the educational system. This is the 21st century. I should be out of work by now. There should be no need for me to teach Black studies at a college level if they re-edit the textbooks, if they re-edit the curriculum and allow a curriculum of inclusion, as Dr. Jeffries and all those educators created in the 1980s, a curriculum of inclusion that is taught from preschool through high school, that educates all of us about the contributions we all make to this country. Until we get to that point where the educational system is corrected, and that's educational apartheid, we will never be, students won't come to my class and say, how come I didn't learn this in high school? That's miseducation. That's what Dr. Carnegie Woodson talked about in his book, Miseducation of the Negro. That's miseducation. That's educational apartheid.
Thank you very much. And it's 8:52. I have one more question before Dr. Myers shuts me down. So with the Black Lives Matter protests that happened in 2020, it feels like we are at the cusp of social change in America. What can the upcoming generation like myself do to continue advocating and fighting for our rights to ensure a better tomorrow for the future generation?
This is the opening door. That question remains to be answered as we move forward through this year and maybe over the next decade, of what will come out of this Black Lives Matter, this door that's been opened, starting with Colin Kaepernick and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, sharing information from our elders, teaching our young people what they went through so that they know that this didn't start with George Floyd or Breonna and all the others who have died. This is not new. This has been going on in this country since we were enslaved. And what we have sacrificed, what we have accomplished, what we have gone through to be where we are today in our societies. The fact that you could have that PhD and that doctorate degree, the fact that I could be a librarian or the president of a member of the board of trustees of Queens Library. These are accomplishments, but they didn't happen in a vacuum. My mother was a college degree teacher in Vicksburg, Mississippi. She could even go to the public library when she was a teacher in Mississippi. So these things don't happen in a vacuum. But without that understanding of history, that understanding of what we have accomplished in spite of slavery and all the other things that we've experienced, some of the people who are looking in on the camera today are older than I am. We are 74. My triplet sister and I are 74. What we experienced, they have gone through even before that. We're standing on their shoulders. So what our children need to understand this and know that the fight for freedom and justice and equality in America is not new. It can be won, and that other America that Martin and Malcolm talked about can be changed to be America, but it's going to take us a revolution that all of us are involved in.
Thank you. Dr. Myers, do I have time for one more question or? Then it's all yours, Dr. Myers.
Well, that was a lot of really great information. I just want to say that there were some comments that came in. Someone also said what I just said, great information. Someone else said absolutely right. There are a lot of people who just didn't have any questions, but they just had comments because it was just so much prepared. People like you are a dime a dozen. So Professor Andrew Jackson, Professor Sekou Malifi Bayako, we thank you so much for being a part of the show. I also would encourage people to look at one of our professor's great works. He public work was Queen's Notes, Facts About the Forgotten Borough of Queens, New York in 2010. So definitely support this brother and go out and check out that book. I think some of the wonderful take-home messages that came along is the fact that slavery caused psychological, physical, emotional abuse on us as a people, which is carried on for generations, which has led to a lot of the medical issues and injustices that we've had to deal with. And even though we've been through a lot of negative things, we also need to remember that there were several positives, and some positives such as Dr. Patricia Bath, who came up with the laser technique that was used for cataracts. She was also the first Black woman to be a chair of ophthalmology in this country, and that was in 1983, which was not that long ago. I know I was alive in 83, so it's pretty sad that, you know, we still have a long ways to go in medicine. And it just is also a fun fact, I am one of the 3% of Black female doctors there are. So the fact that we're 12% of the population and only 3% of doctors are Black women, that's another story for another day. We'll get into that later. And then, of course, Dr. Mae Jameson, another one of my sorors, who was well known because she was actually part of the space. She was the first Black woman female astronaut who went up in space with the shuttle Endeavour. So that's another wonderful thing. But again, this is also in the 80s. So why is it taking so long for us as Black women to make strides, even though we are making it as doctors? And of course, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be a surgeon general. So like, a great example of somebody who she was the first Black female surgeon general in this country. So she was another great role model for many of us. Also, a book that I've read multiple times that we need to check out, great book this month to get, is Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington. It really does a good job of explaining the numerous, of course, we tend to focus on Tuskegee, Henrietta Lacks, Dr. or other stories that need to be told, as mentioned. Professor Jackson, thank you for bringing the book up. And I see you're holding it up. Definitely good meetings for thought. It's a heavy book. It took me time to finish it when I did read it. I had to do it chapter by chapter, but a lot of good information. And in summary, Black history should not just be for one time a year. We need to continue this all year round. It should be 365. So make it your business to learn your history, to teach your children's history, to learn from the elders. As Dr. Jackson said, we're standing on the shoulders of so many amazing people that can tell stories that have never been written or published. And I just want to just let you guys know that our next Black History show is going to cover a topic that is very often considered taboo in our community, but it's something that we need to address, and that's Black trans lives. So of course, Black trans lives matter. As a Black woman, I usually feel like we are towards the end of the totem pole in this country, but our Black trans females have suffered under great distress because unfortunately, when they come up missing or when they are murdered, their cases are never solved. So we hope that you can join us on February 18th at the same time, 8 to 9 p.m., where we're going to talk about how Black trans lives matter. And our featured guests are going to be Louisa Zora, a mother, Olivia Joe, a model and hairstylist, as well as Bryce Henderson, who is a master's in social work, MPH student, and Fatimi Berry, who is the head of education for Freedom March NYC. Also, we will have coming up in March a show that you have asked for. We're going to talk about lupus, which has disproportionately affected the Black community. And we also will have another upcoming show on vaccines in April, so stay tuned. Again, we thank you so much, Mr. Andrew Jackson, for coming today to give this wonderful presentation. And we know that we're going to reach a lot of people. Please make sure that you share it with your friends and family. This was a lot of good information that our children need to hear, as well as our peers need to hear, especially those parts about how our government was not inclusive of us because we were slaves and we were not considered but a 3/5 of a man. So a lot of the things that this country was founded on were not meant for us, but it was meant for white males. And we just have to continue to fight to get our in the door and to continue to get more people into the library science, the PhD world, as well as the medical world. We
Uh,
thank you so much. Maya, do you have any last words before we wrap up tonight? It's 9 o'clock.
do we have time for me to share a poem to close out the program?
Absolutely.
All right. This is a poem entitled Harvard 8985 by a Harlem poet named Bernard J. Keller. And Bernard J. Keller says this: if you cannot be the best for yourself, do it for those who were denied the opportunity to be the best. If you cannot fight the fight for yourself, do it for those who fought the wars but without weapons. If you cannot dream the dream for yourself, dream it for those who could dream but could never make their dreams come true. If you cannot love you for yourself, love you for those who loved you even as they stepped off the slave ships into a new world or stood against those who said they were not men or women. If you cannot be proud for yourself, be proud for those who use pride to sustain themselves when they were sentenced to ride in the back of the bus or brave the wild dogs and open fire hoses in order to cast their vote for a candidate of their choice. Do it for yourself if you can, but whenever you cannot do it for yourself, do it for them. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much for this. We will see you guys in the next 2 weeks. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe. Remember to mind your business, drink your water, celebrate being Black because it's an amazing thing, or celebrate being brown, and just wear your mask and continue to be safe. Thank you. Happy Valentine's Day.
Good night and happy birthday.
Thank you. Peace and blessings.
Bye.
Happy birthday, Dr. Williams.
I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Myers. Goodbye.